This is the final episode in our 6-part series covering unsolved homicide cases in the United States. This episode contains discussion of crime scenes, violence, and death investigation. Listener discretion is advised. This is the Fall Line. Elma is a small city in the county of Grays Harbor, along the western edge of Washington state. According to its official website, it's less than 50 miles from the Pacific coast. The county has always been known for its woodlands. Logging was and is big business there. And per the county's official website, it was once known as the lumber capital of the world. Elma's neighboring town of Aberdeen even had a sign placed to declare that. Logging roads wind through the county, and a little ways north of Elma, off one of those roads, there's a remote patch of woodlands. It sits near Vesta Creek and isn't often visited by people. The occasional hunter, mushroom forager, or logger, they might come through. The retired sheriff's detective we spoke with, Lane Yeomans, told us that cedar foragers might visit to quietly cut blocks from fallen or chopped trees. You can tell if they've been there because they set up what he called a cedar show, logs cut into rounds and then split into blocks. You can generally tell how fresh the work is. It's a decent measure of how recently a clandestine cedar cutter has been into the woods. And that mattered back in October of 1988, because the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office needed to establish how long it'd been since humans had walked through that area of the woods. If anyone besides the hunter, the one who'd contacted them, had come upon the skeletal remains of a woman who'd been left in that remote area. According to police files, on October 24th, 1988, that hunter was in the woods near Vesta Creek when he saw, quote, what looked like a jawbone laying on the ground. The witness picked up the bone to ascertain what type of animal it came from and noticed that one of the teeth had a filling. The witness set the piece of jawbone on a nearby log so he could find it again, and then he went to the Elma Police Department where he reported the incident. Elma seems to have looped in the sheriff's office immediately, as their office filed the originating reports, and 2 detectives accompanied the witness to the area where he'd been walking. Some of what the reporting detective, Lane Yeomans, wrote was that, quote, the area is covered with second-growth timber, and there are a number of cut-shake blocks that are stacked at various locations throughout the area. The blocks appear to have been at the location for many years due to the amount of moss growing on them. The bones that the witness pointed out to us were on top of the ground and consisted of a partial lower jawbone containing several teeth, one of which had a filling in it, a rib bone, and a skull cap. There was also a blue shirt laying on a limb approximately 50 feet west of the bones. I took a series of 35mm photographs of the area, and then Detective Stocks and I began a search for more evidence. A shoe was located approximately 50 feet east of the first site. The toe of the shoe appeared to have been chewed by an animal. A pair of pants that were extremely deteriorated were located approximately 100 feet southeast of the initial site. Several rib bones, several long bones, and a partial pelvic bone were located in the wooded area southwest of the initial site. End quote. That initial search was what could be done before darkness fell. That night would be the first search of many weeks, and then months, and then years. It's estimated the victim's remains had been in the woods for 1 to 2 years, and since that discovery in October of 1988, the Grays County Sheriff's Office has been working on her case ever since. Lane Yeomans was there from the very beginning, first as a detective, then as the county coroner, and now a retired citizen of the county itself who's still determined to see her identified and her homicide case resolved. The victim's remains would eventually be determined to be those of an adult woman. Grays Harbor Jane Doe was ruled the victim of homicidal violence, a gunshot to the head. The victim is described at the time of her death as somewhere between 25 and 40 years old. But remember, these estimates, they're always approximate. She was likely between 4'10" and 5'2", and based on the size of her clothing, around 100 pounds. The victim had a well-healed fracture of the left tibia. When we consulted with a forensic anthropologist, she told us that notation could either mean that the injury was old Or it could mean what it sounds like, that the bone had simply healed well. Grays Harbor Jane Doe was found with a pair of Venezia brand black pants, a blue men's Loren Scott brand shirt, a floral pattern blouse, blue slip-on Woodbridge shoes, size 6.5, which were likely new, and 2 distinct pieces of jewelry. A pearl ring and a silver setting, sold by Avon in 1981. It was a size 6, and a gold earring set with 5 blue sapphires, which was likely made in Asia. Over the years, expert consults and police work have painstakingly built up Grays Harbor Jane Doe's file. That means that science has advanced along with the investigation. For some years, authorities believed that she was a small-statured adult female of Native American ancestry. Later anthropological consultation suggested that she might actually be of Asian ancestry. And now, recent testing through the DNA Doe Project confirms that. They've discovered the Grays Harbor Jane Doe has Cambodian relatives in her family tree and was likely either an immigrant to the country itself or the child of immigrants. According to the Asian Society, the Cambodian diaspora saw at least 130,000 Cambodian refugees resettled in the United States between 1975 and 1985 alone. And per the University of Minnesota, the diaspora is linked to, quote, the Cambodian genocide, which was an explosion of mass violence that saw between 1.5 and 3 million people killed at the hands of the Khmer Rouge, which had taken power in the country following the Cambodian Civil War. Seattle, which is only about 90 miles from Elma, Washington, is currently home to the 3rd largest Cambodian American population in the country. Back in 1988, there were a number of Cambodian immigrants living in the Grays Harbor County area, though we are told by law enforcement that they did not have a missing persons report on file for a Cambodian woman from their area who matched the description of the victim. Now, they did have a few people come forward about possible missing women from the Cambodian immigrant community who could have been a match, but there weren't enough details, no full names, no exact dates and the like, so that they could fully follow up on those leads. Now, though, with forensic investigative genetic genealogy in play, the threads of the Grays County Jane Doe's identity can be connected, but investigators and genealogists still need the help of the local community and our listeners nationwide. They need tips from anyone who lives or lived in Grays Harbor County, and they also need people willing to upload their DNA to GEDmatch to improve the pool of matches for Grays Harbor Jane Doe. They need profile submissions from individuals of Southeast Asian descent to help potentially solve the case. Additionally, the victim has Chinese relatives in her tree, so those submissions, they could be critical as well. The lack of East and Southeast Asian DNA in the public databases makes cases like the Grays Harbor Jane Doe some of the most difficult for researchers to solve. So we bring her case to you today with 2 calls to action in mind: to share the details in hopes of bringing in leads, and to encourage anyone, no matter where they live in the U.S., to upload to GEDmatch. We'll talk more about how you can do that at the end of the episode. We connected with the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office through DNA Doe Project and Light the Way Victims Advocacy, 2 groups you've heard about on our show many times before. When we spoke with the current detective on the case, Paul Logan, he suggested that we interview retired Detective Lane Yeomans regarding Grays Harbor Jane Doe. He's also the detective who has worked on a number of high-profile cases, including the identification of the John Doe formerly known as Lyle Stevick. Detective Yeomans was, as we said, on her case from the very beginning. After all, that first incident report was filed by him, and he has devoted thousands of hours to her case. We have rarely seen this level of police work on a Doe file. There were nearly 500 indigenous tribes contacted with flyers, close to 100 dentists queried, 2 forensic anthropologists consulted for a skeletal analysis. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was rare to even have 1 skeletal analysis report in a file. A forensic podiatrist consulted, a forensic odontologist consulted, and the list goes on. Detective Yeomans, He studied skeletal taphonomy. That's basically learning about postmortem changes in bone, so that he could learn about environmental effects on human remains and better find them in that forest setting. He learned about coyotes and other smaller predators and how they move and scatter human remains. He conducted so many searches that he has lost count, and he pursued DNA testing for possible missing person matches when it was still incredibly rare, back in the early 90s, all in pursuit of this victim's identity. We sat down with retired Detective Yeomans to discuss the investigation into Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case and to learn a little bit more about the area itself.
I began as a deputy sheriff in 1977, and in 1982 I was promoted to detective and retired in 2007. I then began working as a deputy coroner for the Grays Harbor County Coroner's Office, and in 2014 I was elected county coroner and I served a term. We have the luxury, I guess you call it, to be able to devote a lot more time to investigate a case because you don't have other ones stacking up that you need to take care of. I was the crime scene specialist, so I was always researching new techniques. I watched all the crime shows on TV because every now and then I would see them investigate a particular type of crime and it would remind me of something that might be similar. And so I was always learning. You have to, because technology is advancing so fast that you need to keep learning to keep up with it.
For those of us who are not from the area, how remote is it, and what is the Vesta Creek like in terms of vegetation and terrain?
Well, the Vesta Creek area is located in the eastern part of Grays Harbor County. Grays Harbor is 1,910 square miles. Population is about 77,000, so the county is rather rural. This particular area is extremely remote with second growth timber. It's hilly. The ground is covered with sword ferns, salal, blackberries, down tree branches, and tree debris. When we examined the area, we found that someone had been in the area, at least within the last few years. There were several logs that had what appeared to be rather fresh cuts on them, but we weren't sure how long it had been since anyone had been in that area. It was a rather difficult area to search because of all the debris. We had to do multiple searches out at that location, clearing brush, organizing searches, bringing in different groups like a metal detector club. And I was over there at the location at least 60 times, spending entire days out there searching and clearing off the area.
Based on the file, this land was mostly accessed by hunters, loggers, mushroom hunters. Were any people who frequented the area able to offer you any leads or tips for you or other law enforcement to follow?
We spoke with a number of hunters as well as mushroom hunters. It's a good area for chanterelle mushrooms, and most of them hadn't been to that particular portion of the Vesta Creek area, but they knew that it was remote and it was a good area to hunt in as well as hunt for mushrooms. The hunters and mushroom hunters that I spoke with had not been in that area for a long time. One elk hunter was walking through the area one day, and he was also looking for chanterelle mushrooms. That's why he was scanning the forest floor when he spotted a piece of jawbone with 4 teeth in it. He didn't recognize what type of animal it had come from, so he picked it up to examine it, turned it over, and saw that one of the teeth had a filling in it. He then set the piece of jaw on a log so he could find it again, and he left and came and contacted the police. When we interviewed the man, he said that he had not been in that area for several years. The original day that I was out there with the gentleman that found the piece of jaw, the investigations division came out and we scoured the immediate area, photographing and documenting remains that we were finding in that immediate area. We then returned with the Grays Harbor Search and Rescue Group on 2 different occasions to have extensive searches of the area. And I had personally been out at the site at least 60 times, spending entire days clearing off brush, crawling around on my hands and knees, looking for hairs, fibers, bones, anything I could find. And we cleared off an area about the size of half of a football field in order to do a proper, thorough search. I had gone out to the location for a number of years. I would, whenever I had some free time, I would spend a day out there just looking around, reaching down into rodent burrows, under logs, just to find hopefully another bone, another piece of evidence in order to identify this lady. After all of the searches, we had recovered approximately 95% of the skeletal remains. We recovered the lady's shoes, the ring, the earring, and pieces of all of the articles of clothing that she was wearing when she was killed.
I was really struck by the number of experts you consulted, particularly in the late 1980s and early 1990s in this case. Can you talk a little bit about all the avenues that you pursued and what you were told?
There was a pearl ring in a sterling silver setting that I determined was sold by Avon during the winter of 1981. I took the earring to a jeweler who examined it and said that there were 5 blue sapphire stones in a gold setting. He determined that it was most likely Asian manufacture.
Retired Detective Yeoman's research was first conducted in the 1980s and 90s, which means he had very limited access to digital resources. But as he mentioned, he managed to establish the provenance of the victim's clothing and her jewelry. The ring and earrings were particularly promising leads, both because they might be recognized by family and because the ring was identified as a very specific model produced by Avon in the winter of 1981. At that time, Avon sales were done almost exclusively in person by representatives who had catalogs and samples. The familiar term back then was Avon ladies. They were local women who mainly worked as distributors in what has generally been described as a direct selling business model. That meant that detectives could identify and speak to anyone in the area who was selling Avon products and show them photos of that ring. Yeoman said that he spoke to everyone, but no one had any information on the jewelry. But they hoped that by showing pictures of the earrings and the ring to friends and family of missing persons, it might be helpful in the future. So ultimately, they were still a valuable lead. There was something else, though, that was discovered in the area, not on the victim, but nearby, at the scene.
At the site, there was also a bottle of Hires root beer that was found. I checked with the Hires bottling company and gave them the production number. They said the bottle was filled on April 30th, 1987. Now, there was no other trash in the area, and it was very close to where this woman was killed. So I assume that this belonged to either the victim or the suspect. The bottle can help establish the possible date of the murder. According to the bottling company, they said that normally when a bottle of soda is filled and shipped out to the stores, it's sold between 30 and 60 days.
As mentioned, this information may be helpful in narrowing down the rough time when the victim's death and the crime occurred. And Yeoman says that he has used this method before. He actually solved a case based on the manufacturing and lot dates on a pack of cigars in a murder investigation. It is valuable to remember that, even with technology advancing, going back to what was discovered and the quality of the original investigation, that information can be vital in a case. The detective consulted a number of forensic specialists too, including one that we have never encountered before in our work, a forensic podiatrist. We spoke about those efforts during our interview.
I took the jaw to a forensic odontologist who talked about the filling in the teeth, said that the teeth were worn. He gave me some estimations as to how old this person was. I took the bones to a forensic anthropologist who examined them and said that it appeared she had had neck and back problems, that the lady had a well-healed left tibia, so she'd had a broken leg at one time. He estimated that she had been dead from 1 to 5 years, said that she was about 5'2", perhaps around 110 pounds, and she was Native American. I later took the remains to another forensic anthropologist who came up with the same estimation, although he said that she might be Southeast Asian. I took the shoes that were found at the site to a forensic podiatrist who said that it appeared she'd only worn the shoes about 3 days. I was willing to talk to anyone who could help provide more information to get this lady identified.
The wear pattern on the shoes is interesting because it indicates that they were new. If someone remembered selling them to Grays Harbor Jane Doe, that could have produced a lead, but it would depend on getting that information in front of the right person. We've seen very specific information about shoes or clothing lead to stores before. That was the case here in Georgia, where the pair of Timberland boots of William Deshaun Hamilton, formerly known as Dennis Doe, were traced to a well-known Atlanta shoe store. And, honestly, Detective Yeoman says he wasn't really sure what a forensic podiatrist could tell him, but he was, as he said, willing to consult anyone who could give him insight. If, for instance, Grays Harbor Jane Doe had a specific wear pattern that indicated something about her gait, or an irregularity with her feet that could have helped with her description, any of that information, it could have been valuable. It's the same reason that he spoke to 2 forensic anthropologists at a time when it was not necessarily common to even see one skeletal analysis report in a file. We've discussed this on the show before, in detail, and you can listen to our episodes on the Twiggs County John Doe for a more in-depth explanation. But differing ancestry or race estimations are something that we expect to see in some cases. Forensic anthropology is not a static science, and human beings are not cookie-cutter specimens who all perfectly fit into assigned molds. The systems for classifying a person's remains via the biological profile, that's ancestry, which roughly translates to race, sex, age, and stature, are based on decades of data collection. But these estimates are still that, estimates, and they may be revised when more information becomes available or a second opinion is offered. Detective Yeomans took both estimations seriously, and he did not rule out anyone who did not match those ancestry estimations either. There were a number of indigenous residents in the county and a smaller Asian population. The sheriff's office did quite a lot of canvassing among locals to try and pinpoint if someone had gone missing who had not been reported. But they also reached out to other law enforcement for help too. By the time that the Grays Harbor Jane Doe was discovered, the Green River Task Force had been operating for some time. In archival articles that we found, there was mention made that the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office had reached out to the task force for consultation. They did not consider Grays Harbor Jane Doe to be a likely victim of the then unknown Green River killer, Gary Ridgway. This was likely based on distance. Grays Harbor County is several hours from King County, where the suspected Green River victims had been recovered. But it was still important to speak to that task force for a number of reasons. At the time you were investigating Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case, local news made mention that you consulted with the Green River Task Force, though that wasn't necessarily a major lead. Was that simply something that you needed to do in Washington when investigating an unidentified persons case? What kind of resources did they have in terms of missing persons data?
It was common practice whenever you had a case like this that you would reach out to the Green River Task Force because they were having a number of murders there that were associated to one person. And so I reached out to them to see if there might be a connection between their series of murders and our Jane Doe case. I gave them all the information that I had put together regarding our case, and they felt that it was not part of their series. When I reached out to the task force, I wanted to see if there were missing women that they were looking at as potential victims of the Green River Killer, to see if it might match my Jane Doe. We spent some time going over what I had, and there was nothing that was beneficial to my investigation.
One thing that the retired detective highlighted was the sheer amount of data that the task force had amassed at that time. When it came to missing women in Washington, their resources would have been valuable no matter what. This was long before you could simply consult NamUs or put out the kind of sophisticated queries that law enforcement can today. We also talked about some of the missing women in the area that the sheriff's office seriously considered as possible matches for the Grays Harbor Jane Doe. Most were fairly early possible matches, people who came up in the first few years after her disappearance. So my understanding is that you looked at a few missing women in particular that you compared with Grays Harbor Jane Doe. Do you have any information regarding whether they were ruled in or out? And if so, do you know if they are still missing today?
As I gathered information concerning my Jane Doe, I would consult with the Washington State Patrol Missing Persons Unit for a list of missing women that might fit my Jane Doe. And a lot of them I was able to exclude because of dental or other features. There were several cases that I didn't have any dental on, so I would have to go to other efforts in order to include them or exclude them. There was a woman by the name of Colleen Moran who disappeared in 1985. She left her 3-year-old son with a babysitter and was going to walk 3 blocks down to a tavern, but there was no indication that she ever arrived. There was an extensive search, but they were unable to find her. I checked her description, and it was very close to my Jane Doe. I contacted the local dentists in the Port Orchard area, which is about 70 miles from Grays Harbor, to see if they had dental records on her, but nobody had that. I contacted her mother, Wanda Martley, who said that Colleen had originally come from Fairfield, California, which is outside of San Francisco. I had Mrs. Martley sign a release for dental information, and I sent copies of that to 85 dentists in the Fairfield area, but didn't receive any response. I found out sometime later that many dentists will purge files from patients when they haven't seen them for 7 years. So I contacted Mrs. Martley and obtained a DNA sample from her, as well as Colleen's father, and I sent them to Dr. Charles Ginther down in California to conduct a DNA examination. Sometime later, he sent me a letter saying that there was no match. And as far as I know, Colleen Moran is still missing. There were several cases that looked promising and could not be excluded through dental, and so I had to take the extra steps of contacting family members to obtain DNA samples, and they were excluded through the DNA analysis.
As we said at the top of the episode, the department used DNA to rule out a number of possible matches, including a woman from Puerto Rico who'd gone missing in the continental U.S. But they were also working on a few local leads that had frustratingly few concrete details. When they spoke to locals, they were told about several Cambodian women who might have gone missing, women for whom there were no reports filed. One resident mentioned that a family who'd been living in the Elma area with 2 teenage daughters had, quote, disappeared one day, but offered no more detail than that. And then another lead came in years later when Yeomans was coroner. A resident let them know that a dealer at a local casino had a cousin who'd babysat for a Cambodian couple in Elma back in the 1980s. That resident remembered hearing that the wife of that couple had, quote, disappeared, and the husband and 2 kids had moved to Stockton, California. When the detectives spoke with the casino dealer, who'd also immigrated from Cambodia, they got more details, but things were not necessarily clarified. They also sat down with the husband of the dealer's cousin, and it turned out that no one had actually babysat for anyone else, but they'd all known each other through the community. They said that the husband of the couple was named Ty, and his wife, Monsi. They were not sure of the family's surname. The cousin's husband had first met Ty in a refugee camp in Cambodia in the late 1970s, and they'd reconnected when they both moved to Washington. He said Ty and Monsi had lived in a 2-story home in Elma, and he'd last seen Ty at a temple celebration in the 90s or the early 2000s. He wasn't sure what had become of the marriage between Ty and Monsi. The casino dealer said that he'd last seen Ty in the 2010s in Stockton, California, working at what he described as, quote, a Cambodian store, and he hadn't seen Monsi there. But it was unclear as to whether Monsi had ever actually gone missing. Neither man had any information on that. Detectives did follow up on the history of the home in hopes of getting current contact information for the couple, but there were no such records. Investigators are still hoping to speak to Ty and to Monsi, so if you knew of a couple by those names, and the names may not be exact, who lived in the Grays Harbor area around 1986, please do get in touch with the sheriff. We'll have that contact information at the end of the show. When we spoke with retired Detective Yeomans, we discussed some of the other outreach methods that he pursued in the 1980s and 1990s.
When I became aware that the lady might be Cambodian, I sent the flyer as well as information about the case to a Cambodian newspaper in Seattle to see if that could generate any leads, but it never did. I tried to get as much publicity out there to the public as possible. So there were a number of articles that our local newspaper, the Daily World, would run from time to time to keep the interest in identifying the woman. I also had our county commissioners approve a $5,000 reward just for the lady's name. We created posters with a clay reconstruction of the woman's face, along with pictures of the jewelry. I had sent flyers out to every Native American tribe in the U.S. because back then we had thought that she might be Native American. I found it's important to keep interest in the case in the forefront, hoping that someone might remember something that could be useful to us. I encountered a lot of difficulties in trying to obtain information that might be useful to this investigation. As for the dental records, like I say, dentists have a tendency to purge files after 7 years of not seeing a patient. There's a lot of information that disappears and can no longer be used. It's important for the public to be aware of the case. Hopefully, after even this much time, this might trigger a memory of someone that lived in the Elma area that could help us identify the lady.
Do you believe that she was a resident of the area, or perhaps from further out of town like Seattle, or do you believe she was from somewhere else entirely?
The location where the body was found, and we determined that the lady was killed at the location where she was found, was so remote. I find it hard to believe that someone just randomly drove her out there. This is a heavily wooded area that is 4 miles from the nearest paved road. You have to travel on a logging road making numerous turns to get to this spot. This had to be someone who had been there before and knew the area, either as a hunter or a mushroom picker, or there are many people that go out in the woods to harvest bear grass, salal, ferns, mushrooms. But it's somebody, I believe, that had been there before. They knew the area.
In 2018, a new avenue of possible identification opened up for Grays Harbor County in the wake of the Golden State Killer's capture and the public's sudden awareness of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, something that many researchers have been involved in for years. The sheriff's office realized they had a new option. They reached out to the DNA Doe Project, which had officially been established the year before. We've had representatives of the DNA Doe Project on the show many times, but we thought it would be helpful to have Pam Lauritsen, DDP's Executive Director of Media and Communications, speak a little bit more about how they approach their casework and the practicalities of FIGG before we get to their work on Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case.
As a nonprofit, we really bring two powerful tools to our casework. So first is the fact that our investigative genetic genealogists are experts and they're also volunteers. So they provide their work on the cases pro bono. And they're the best in the field. The field is really still emerging, and there are so many more people joining in this work. Our more than 80 volunteers have been doing it the longest of any group that's out there. And because they're volunteers, they can work for as long as it takes to bring resolution to a case. And sometimes that numbers the thousands of hours. So some other providers who pay their researchers may need to limit the amount of time spent because it's expensive. You know, these are experts. They deserve an expert pay rate. But because our experts are volunteers, that helps us keep the cost low. Secondly, we underwrite every single case with funds donated to DNA Doe Project. So our costs to run a case range anywhere from the lab work to process a sample into a DNA profile and professional case management that we provide to the agencies who work with us. There's a lot of communications, there's a lot of record keeping, and of course, there's a lot of secure platforms that we use in order to do this work.
So when DNA Doe Project gets a new case, what's the order of operations? How do you begin?
We start with a biological sample from the remains, and we try to pick the best option that's likely to get enough DNA to develop a working profile that we can use for genetic genealogy. We have worked with all kinds of samples: bone, tissue, blood, even rootless hair. And we work with the best labs in the business. First, the DNA is extracted, and then it goes through a series of processes to analyze the DNA and determine as much of the human genome as possible. This is called sequencing or whole genome sequencing or next generation sequencing. From there, a specialist in bioinformatics, who's kind of a data scientist, formats that data into a profile that's suitable to upload to the three databases that we can use. And those are GEDmatch, FTDNA, and DNA Justice. These are the databases that allow access for law enforcement cases, both for suspect work and also for unidentified remains work like the DNA Doe Project does. These profiles are kind of equivalent to the same type of DNA profile that people can download from direct-to-consumer sites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe.com. So when people take a DNA test, they can download their profile and then they can upload it to the databases that we use for our cases. So once we have our profile uploaded to the databases, then we start to look at the list of matches to our profile. So we don't actually look into anyone's individual DNA. What we're doing is looking for the relationships. So how much DNA is shared with our Jane Doe, how much DNA is shared between the matches in the list. That helps us to kind of develop a sense of who the relatives are, how they're related to Jane Doe, and then to start to build a family tree.
We've talked with DNA Doe Project before about the minimum match thresholds genealogists hope to see when they begin their work. But I'd love for you to refresh our audience a little. If I'm correct, you really need relatives at least the 20 to 30 centimorgan threshold, and you're hoping for connections in the triple digits to help you begin to build a victim's tree. Is this correct?
Yes, it can be. So we really believe that if there is DNA and we can get a workable profile, any case can be solved with enough time and effort. That's kind of our superpower. We can definitely work with very low matches, but it's a long haul to do that. We also need to be able to connect those matches to each other in order to start to build the family tree. And that's part of the challenge with this particular case. So her matches are not only distantly related to her, but none of them are closely related to each other as well. So it's really hard to narrow down what branch of the tree any of these people fit into. Centimorgans in the triple digits represent a much closer relationship to the Doe, and that helps us narrow down the right branch of the tree more quickly.
We asked Pam to explain how DDP became involved in Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case. And it turns out, they've been working on it for a long time. In fact, they began months after DNA Doe Project announced its first official case solve. They were finally able to confirm what retired Detective Yeomans had suspected and the second forensic anthropologist had suggested, that Grays Harbor Jane Doe was of Southeast Asian descent and was likely a Cambodian immigrant or the child of Cambodian immigrants. DNA data and surnames in her tree indicated as much, as did the dates tied to the names in her tree.
This case goes all the way back to July 2018 when we had first contact with the Grays Harbor Sheriff's Department. So it makes it one of our very oldest cases that's yet unsolved. It took some time to get this case through the labs. So in order to create a DNA profile, it took another couple of years, and our team of investigative genetic genealogists first started work on that side of the work in September 2021. Right away, the team knew it was going to be a really, really tough case. The matches are very distant, and the highest match in the list is likely a third or fourth cousin, which is really tough to research.
What are some of the unique challenges you face when you're working the case of a recent immigrant to the U.S.?
Recent immigrants are often really difficult to research because their relatives are still typically in the country of origin. And there are so many places around the world that either restrict DNA testing overall, or where the population just really hasn't done a lot of DNA testing, and especially hasn't uploaded to the databases that we can use for our research. So if somebody lives in Southeast Asia, they're not very likely to upload a DNA profile to GEDmatch, which is our primary database. The records involved are also really difficult to access. So we often need to find someone who has language experiences in that language of origin. And because we're working remotely, we don't have researchers in Cambodia, which is most likely where Jane Doe's family originated. It makes it tough for us to access records that are not available online. I was just looking at a site this morning that has some Cambodian birth and death records, and the records tap out the top end date on those records is 1914. So that would not really help us in our research to go back and look at those, unless we can build a family tree all the way back to people that would have been living in that time frame. We do have volunteers and at the DNA Doe Project who have specialized skills, and we're often recruiting volunteers with specialized skills, but it definitely creates a bigger challenge. The records that would exist, the likelihood of them being available to us is so incredibly slim. And, you have to know that a lot of these people that were fleeing war in Southeast Asia in the 70s and 80s, that didn't come to the US through an official process. And so even when they arrived, there might not be a lot of records of them in this country. That kind of immigration creates a huge disconnect with families and communities, and it makes it really, really difficult to find people who died without their names. The database is really populated overwhelmingly with white and Western European people who immigrated, a long time ago. So they're generations of their family in the US, in US records. So it just makes cases of white people that much easier to resolve. Our hardest cases are those like Grays Harbor Jane Doe, who is likely an immigrant herself or the child of immigrants from Cambodia.
Records are certainly needed to help build out genealogical information, but the fact is that many of those documents simply no longer exist or are currently out of reach. So other data is desperately needed to solve this case via genetic genealogy. So, Pam, how can listeners help? Do you need testers to upload to GEDmatch? What else can we do?
That's a great question. Everyone can help with Jane and John Doe cases like Grays Harbor County Jane Doe. It's an incredibly personal decision to take a DNA test and to upload your profile to sites like GEDmatch, FTDNA, or DNA Justice.
Pam wanted me to stress that the database is severely lacking in uploads from all Asian ancestry communities, and anyone willing to share their profiles to GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, or the new site, DNA Justice, would be providing information for some of the most difficult to solve Doe cases. As we said, in Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case, her family tree matches include relatives from Southeast Asian countries outside Cambodia too, anyone with ancestry in Cambodia and other areas of Southeast Asia, including, but not limited to, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and the Philippines, are encouraged to share. And again, she has DNA matches outside Southeast Asia too, specifically in China. As a reminder, we have a link in our show notes to a blog post that we made explaining how you can download results that you already have from Ancestry or 23andMe, and then easily upload them to GEDmatch. We asked Pam if there were additional ways to contribute to solving Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case and other cases that DDP is working on today.
In addition to uploading the DNA profiles themselves, it's really, really useful for people to create a basic family tree of the relatives they know and to attach that to their profiles. Those family names can be the one clue that leads us to the right branch of a family tree. Now, DNA Doe Project, we will continue to do this important work for as long as it takes, but we also need money to do what we do. We're the largest nonprofit in the field, but we could be bigger and we could do more. There are more than 14,000 Jane and John Does in NamUs alone, and that's probably an underestimate of the number of cases that exist in the US. All these cases are waiting to get their names back, and support from people like your listeners makes it possible for us to take these cases, even the hardest cases, even the cases where the agencies have no money to pursue investigative genetic genealogy as a technique. And those donations help us bring these does back to their families and communities.
When we spoke to Lane Yeomans, who's been working on Grays Harbor Jane Doe's case since that very first day, in October of 1988, and has had new hope for resolution since FIGG became a possibility 6 years ago, we talked about the long pursuit for resolution. Because as in many unidentified cases, it's twofold: identifying a victim and then discovering who was responsible for their homicide. In a Doe case, many of the factors that can help investigators solve a murder, the connections that thread through a life, have been snipped. Reconnecting a decedent to their name is often the first vital step in the second case, the homicide. But Grays Harbor Jane Doe has never just been a case for the retired detective. He's been focused for decades on the person she was in life and finding her loved ones, and then her killer. Based on your decades of work trying to identify Jane Doe, what do you think will be key, especially now that we do have some genetic genealogical leads?
Well, I know that somebody knows something. Somebody will remember that back in the late 80s, there was a couple perhaps living in the Elma area, and one day they were gone. And perhaps people thought that the two of them moved away, but only one moved. I think it's important just to keep this in the public's memory, hoping that one day that we can get this lady identified. I've worked on this case a long time, and I've had a lot of success identifying unknown bodies. This was the one case that I never could solve. This is one of the cases that has stayed with me even after all these years. We had a detective put together a clay reconstruction of the lady's face. I carried that picture in my wallet for years. I had a blow-up of it hanging over my desk at the sheriff's department and at the coroner's office. There are many times that I would wake up in the middle of the night with an idea of maybe being able to identify her and getting dressed and driving to work on the case. I can't count how many hours I've volunteered or donated to trying to get her identified. All of the days I spent out at the site on my hands and knees, searching the soil just for any scrap piece of her that might help identify her. It's one of the cases that I just can't let go of.
If you have information regarding the woman known as Grays Harbor Jane Doe, please contact detectives at the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office at 360-964-1798. If you are interested in uploading your DNA profile to one of the sites that we have discussed but need additional assistance past our blog, reach out to us at falllinepodcast@gmail.com. We will connect you with further resources. You can also find a link to donate to the DNA Doe Project in our show notes. We'll be back soon with a new season and new cases, and a mid-season episode in July. So be sure to stay subscribed. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on our show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research assistance by Brian Waters. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams and Vic Kennedy. As always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.